Let's take a quick look at the four major parts of chapter 18, which is mostly an economics chapter, dealing with what's going on in Europe. The economic recovery portion sort of deals with what's going on in Europe during the 17 to 1800s. The chapter then goes and takes a look at really Europe's relationship to the New World, the Atlantic world, as we would call it. It goes back to Europe, takes a little bit of a look at society, which we won't spend a whole lot of time on, that you can kind of read for yourself. And then finally, at the end, deals with the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the beginnings of really major Industrial Revolution topics. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the high points of this chapter. The first part of the chapter really deals with what's going on in Europe, and the textbook points out that because of better diet, because of thanks to contact with New World, new crops coming back to Europe, for example, there was an agricultural revolution taking place in Europe. People were getting better at raising crops. They were getting better at raising meat sources. They were dealing with different ways of fertilizing their fields, enclosing fields to make sure that you're more efficient and productive when it comes to farmland. All of these things led to a massive explosion in population. Statistics indicate that population may have grown in Europe by 50% from 1700 to 1800. The estimated population of Europe in 1700 was 95 million or so. It had grown to 146 million by 1800, mostly in England and France. Better diet, better fields, better food, declining mortality rates, all of those things led to an increase in population. That's going to be big later on when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, because that is a growing source of labor. The Europe was also beginning to trade in the larger world. Europe here, as its population grows, is going to begin to integrate itself into a wider world. The One of the things that you start to see is Europe is setting itself up to become an industrialized system. The farming techniques are getting better, manufacturing techniques are getting better, and really work is starting to change. You'll read about the putting out system, which increases Europe's ability to manufacture. For example, English linen exports jumped from 180,000 yards of linen, cotton cloth essentially, in 1730 to 9.6 million yards in 1760. That is a huge increase in 30 years. And it's because of better techniques, more people working, new types of work in urban areas. And so Europe is changing, really, it is changing the way it's thinking about work. It's changing, really, society. It is changing the way we think about wealth. One of the things that you see is many states in Europe, both absolute and constitutional, had adopted a system known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is all about trying to make sure that your nation, no matter what, was able to increase its overall wealth even at the expense of others. The Mercantilists believed that states needed to have a favorable balance of trade. They needed to export more than they import. They needed to increase their holdings of gold and silver. They need to get raw materials from colonies, even if they have to. The All of these states are competing with one another, and they want to make sure that they can improve their economies, even if it means harming someone else. In the meantime, as an outgrowth of the Enlightenment, you have groups that intellectual thinkers, economic thinkers like Adam Smith, part of a group called the Physiocrats, which were really enlightened thinkers about economics. Physiocrats kind of coined this term. In French, it's called laissez-faire, all right, which in French literally means allowed to do, all right. But what laissez-faire economists wanted was the wanted governments to stop regulating the economy. In Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, he wanted less government involvement in the economy. If you divide up labor, if you allow the economy to work instead of having the government really micromanage every part of the economy, then it will get better. And less regulation was what Adam Smith was after. And that's kind of a new sort of idea about wealth. The textbook also talks about the consumer revolution, where people began to buy stuff that changing diet, changing clothing, really made people everywhere from rich to middle to poor start to do things a little bit different. Okay, they changed the way they decorated their rooms. They changed the clothes they wore. Even the poor would be interested in doing things like that. And they're eating new foods, especially things like sugar and tea and coffee and chocolate, all of which have to be imported into Europe. So that's going to put sort of a stress on some of these other areas. The uh, the text then talks about the Atlantic world and the Atlantic economy. Essentially, this is what we used to discuss as the triangle trade, that goods were moving from Europe to Africa in exchange for African slaves. Slaves would then cross the Atlantic in what was called the Middle Passage, where they would be sold into slavery in parts of South America, Central America, North America, and used as labor to produce goods that would then be sent back to Europe, and the whole cycle would start again. The one example of this is sugar. Remember, I just told you that sugar was in high demand, so sugar was profitable, but it's labor intensive. It is incredibly labor intensive, and as such, you need labor. In parts of South America and in the Caribbean, for example, the major sugar producing areas, in places like Brazil for Portugal, or in the Caribbean for the Spanish, and then later the English as well in the West Indies, you needed labor. The Native American labor had all disappeared because of disease. And so the only solution was to import labor, and that came from Africa. So the sugar really fuels this idea of plantation styles economies using labor. The sugar really fuels that. All in all, slave traders maybe bring 10 to 12 million African slaves over the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, mostly to the Caribbean and Brazil. About 80% of slaves exported out of Africa end up in either Portugal or in the Caribbean. 10 to 20% of those will die along the voyage. So there is a really, if you read about the Middle Passage, you can see that it is a dreadful part of the slave trade. But the kind of the sad part of it is it becomes a self-perpetuating system. The slaves that would be brought over were doing so to fuel sugar and to fuel the labor system, and slaves had to be fed and clothed, and so then that sort of fuels the need for more textiles. So it becomes really a really system that feeds on itself. The So you can kind of follow the idea of trade here and you guys can look this up on in the chapter and on the PowerPoint, but you can see this triangle trade of how things move here to here and then of course back to Europe. The uh, the chapter talks a little bit about the Spanish and Portuguese empires. You can read that for yourself. The it then goes on to talk about the French and British empires as well. Remember, the idea is to get raw materials as cheaply as possible. They want to have a footprint in North America. So you have the French in Canada and in the Caribbean and in India to some extent. You have the British who have 13 American colonies. Then, after they fight the war with France, the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War in Europe, they will control most of North America, really defeating the French and booting them out of their colonies in North America. The When Britain defeats France in this, it also does so makes it very expensive for the Americans. They need to tax the American colonies, and when that happens, it leads to the American War for Independence. And you can read about that. That's a it's kind of a symptom of this new Atlantic economy. The From there, the next part is next part of the chapter, which you guys can read for yourself, is about European society. You will talk about the different classes, the poor especially, and how they would protest. So make sure that you kind of read this section of the chapter, okay? And especially about the way the Enlightenment influenced this. One of the things that you'll see, and you can kind of key in here because we'll see it again, is this concept of what a nation is. And later on, we'll have a whole chapter that deals with nothing except nationalism. And you might as well sort of kind of get in your mind what the nation is. The chapter finishes, though, talking about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. You'll learn about as you read remember, we talked about how cloth and clothing were increasing during this period. There was a bigger need for that. So innovations, all right, new technology like the flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, the water frame, spinning mule, the origins of the factory, mechanization, power, all of those things are discussed. And you get everything from the inventors of the factory system to Wedgwood and the invention of porcelain, really mass-produced porcelain, James Watt and the development of the steam engine and the improvements that Watt made on the Newcomen engine. And you have now a means of power to power these factories. All that's going to lead to an increase in production. And that's an important step. You have to satisfy these demands. And so factory system and really the ability to mass produce items is going to be a major development. The chapter ends with probably the most important part, okay? And it's one of the questions that you could write about on your exam, okay? Why England? Why does the Industrial Revolution begin in England? England has a specific set of advantages that is discussed in the chapter. They have the agricultural production necessary to feed a workforce. Remember, if you're going to take workers and put them in the factories, then they aren't producing food. They are doing something else. And they need food because they are working in the factories. You have skilled workers. You have people that have money that will invest in in industrial production. You have England's development of its navy and its massive amount of transportation resources, natural resources like iron and coal, political stability, a good government, all right, the availability of capital, which is money. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution begins in England because England has these resources. So make sure that you understand why the Industrial Revolution begins in England. All right, this is it for this chapter. And as we move towards our first exam, make sure that you take a look at the study guide and the study video I have up for the first exam.